All right. Hey guys, welcome back. This is our third lecture on Reconstruction. And today we're going to be talking about the second phase of Reconstruction. This is the radical phase or radical Reconstruction, or you could just call it Congressional Reconstruction because guess who's taking those reins? That's right, it's Congress. Okay. So last time we talked about how President Johnson was a drunken mess of a man and really screwing some things up, and not too many people liked him. He didn't have a lot of friends. Remember that Andrew Johnson will be the first president impeached. We will be talking about that. And his policy for Reconstruction was very lenient, meaning very easy on these Southern whites who had just been in open rebellion against the Union. He basically said 10% of anybody who shows up can form a new Southern state constitution or government and then be seated and returned, completely reintegrated into the United States like nothing ever happened, like 700,000 deaths just wiped under the rug. It was pretty horrifying. So when those new Confederate, or I should say Southern now, the Confederacy has ended. The Civil War was won by the North. There is no more Confederacy, supposedly. When these new Southern representatives elected under these new Johnson governments of the South begin to go to Washington, D.C., these representatives and senators to be seated, the Congress refuses to allow them to sit. Like I said, it was so blatantly bad that you had former Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stevens actually returning as a senator from Georgia. And it's like, no, we fought a war over this. You don't get to just come back without impunity, without punishment. And it's not so much that radical Republicans or those more hardcore Republicans in Congress that were more supporting of African American rights. That's the radical Republicans. It's not just that they wanted the South to pay for the Civil War. I mean, that's part of it, a little bit, the punishment, but it's also the black coats that infuriated these Republicans in Congress. Remember in the 1860 election, it was, black Republicans and Abraham Lincoln. He's supporting those black men. There's all this rhetoric going around the South here after the Civil War that the black Republicans are going to try to, give African Americans total equality and give them actual superiority over the whites, that poor Southern white women are going to be terrorized and raped by these African Americans who are going to be unleashed upon them by the black Republican Party. Like there's all this rhetoric and propaganda going around. And in response to the South lashing out and trying to retain its Southern way of life, we had the institution of the Black Codes in every Southern state that basically were meant to oppress the African American population and try to resume a system of forced labor that was as close to the antebellum slave system that they could get now in this new post-Civil War world. And that was intolerable to these radical Republicans. What had the war been about if not the emancipation, if not about true freedom for African Americans? Because that's what the radicals, that's why they're called radicals, it's what they believe. So it was really the Black Codes that galvanized them to take back control. And first act they're going to do is they're going to refuse to let those Southerners from the Johnson governments have any say. They block them out. So Republicans are going to be in total control of Congress, both the House and the Senate, because Democrats will not be allowed to be seated. When I say Democrats, I'm mainly referring at this time in our country's history in the late 1860s to the South. There are still some Northern Democrats, more on them later. And so for radicals, they want to guarantee freedom for African Americans, and that means guaranteeing a life for these newly freed individuals, not just freedom in words like Johnson was having, but also freedom to own land and to exercise their rights as American citizens, and the right to vote, suffrage. Some of the most important radical Republicans in Congress you need to be aware of are Charles Sumner, here pictured left. Remember, Charles Sumner was the one who had suffered that severe caning, like a cane had been taken over his head on the floor of the United States Senate chamber. And this was in the 1850s in the lead up to the Civil War. He had been basically giving a speech that was deriding a Southern senator, and that Southern senator's nephew, who was a member of the House of Representatives, went after Sumner right there on the floor of the Senate, and he cornered him at his desk, literally trapped him there, and just started beating him over the head, and fractured his skull in several places. That Charles Sumner. He has spent the last several years, basically most of the Civil War, trying to recuperate, going to spas and clinics all around the world to try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, basically put his skull back together. So I mean, he is back. He is bruised but not broken, and he is one of the leaders of this radical Republican movement in the Senate, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. The other prominent radical Republican you should definitely be aware of is Thaddeus Stevens, and he's pictured there on the right. He's the one that looks like Tommy Lee Jones. Thaddeus Stevens is a very interesting guy. He was born clubfoot. His father abandoned their family when he was young. He had a very difficult life, really not born rich at all, like a lot of these congressmen back in the day. And he was brilliant. He worked his way through school and, went to night school to become a lawyer. And he actually, interesting Thaddeus Stevens story. He actually was kind of in a what do you call it, when you're unofficially married to somebody for living with them for a certain amount of time. Like basically, he had a spouse who he was not allowed to marry because she was a Black woman who was his maid. But and he would have married her, but they could not legally do that under the law at the day. But that was his wife, basically a Black woman. And I mean, it's pretty rare for this day and age, a member of the House of Representatives. And when he dies, he actually dies in 1868, right after doing leading a lot of this radical movement. He doesn't live very long. His health was very poor at this time. But when he dies, he makes sure that he's buried in this integrated cemetery in Pennsylvania, because he said he wanted in death to be remembered for what he believed in life, which was equality above all. Because remember, most cemeteries, like everything, were segregated back in the day. So he put his corpse where his mouth is. That sounded really bad. I'm gonna take that back. All right, so those are some of your radical Republicans. You need to know that they are going to be taking over control from Johnson. And what I mean by that is, since they have the votes in Congress, nothing that President Johnson is going to want to do is going to be able to pass. They will be able to have the votes to literally override anything Johnson tries to veto. And Johnson vetoed more legislation from the radical Republicans, remember Johnson's a Democrat, than any other president before him. Even more vetoes than like Andrew Jackson. Okay, something about those Andrews, right? King Andrew was also a nickname that they didn't just give Jackson, they also gave to Johnson for all of his vetoes. But radicals are going to pass the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 over Johnson's veto. So the president gets this bill from the radicals in the House. There's Thaddeus Stevens in the Senate, Charles Sumner, and he is going to veto it. What the bill said was basically that if you're born in this country, you are an American citizen entitled to equal protections under the law. And it was basically meant to keep those black codes from being from targeting African Americans. So it's very similar to the language of what we're about to see, the 14th Amendment. It's a really big, really landmark law that basically changes the whole scope of civil rights in the United States, and was meant to really make the Civil War about this issue of freeing and giving equality to newly freed individuals. So Johnson vetoes it. When this happens procedurally under our Constitution, it's not like the bill is automatically dead, okay? And there are other ways that a president can get rid of a bill without actually vetoing it or putting that X on it. For instance, the Wade Davis bill, this was a proposal by the radical Republicans in Congress while Lincoln was still alive, while the war was still happening. The Wade Davis bill is the one that actually, instead of Lincoln's 10% plan, required a majority of the Southern 1860s voting population to give a ironclad oath of allegiance in order to be able to reinstitute a new state constitution. And of course, that would be impossible because a majority is over half. And the ironclad oath, let me show that to you real quick. It was pretty ironclad. I, my name, do solemnly swear or affirm that I have never voluntarily borne arms against the United States. It's going to be hard for like over half of the Confederates because remember, like they only had 9 million people, and remember, like a whole bunch, like 900,000 of the white men in the South, like served in the Confederate military. So that first part's going to be real difficult. Since I have been a citizen thereof, and I have voluntarily given no aid, countenance, counsel, or encouragement to persons engaged in armed hostility thereto. Again, that's going to be almost impossible to find half of the Southerners that could say that they have done none of that and pledge basically under oath that they did not do that. That I have neither sought nor accepted nor attempted to exercise the functions of any office whatever under any authority or pretended authority in hostility to the United States. So if you've been a Southern politician under the Confederate government, you're not going to be able to rejoin or have any enfranchisement in this new United States, or in the United States, I should say. I have not yielded a voluntary support to any pretended government, authority, power, constitution within the United States, hostile or inimical. I looked up that word earlier because I wasn't sure what it meant. It just meant like when you're trying to harm something. There too. And I do further swear that, to the best of my knowledge and ability, I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter, so help me God. Sorry, I don't know why I turned into like Colonel, what's his face? It's my southern twang going there. Don't ask me to do Scarlett O'Hara, guys. It's bad. It's real bad. But anyway, that Ironclad Oath of Allegiance, I wanted to read that to you guys because basically you need to understand what the radicals proposed under the Wade Davis bill that Lincoln is going to do what's called a pocket veto to was impossible. They were not expecting the South to be able to meet those requirements for a majority to be able to truthfully say that pledge, meaning under the Wade Davis bill, radicals did not want the South to be able to re-enter the nation. They would not be able to reinstitute new state governments. They wanted the South to be a subjugated territory, and that was what many radicals originally proposed. What Lincoln did with that Wade Davis bill was he just let it sit. Okay, so the bill came to the president's desk and he just kind of moved it off to the side. He did not veto it. He did not sign it. He just let it sit. And if you do that and Congress goes out of session, you're basically allowing the bill to die quietly without having to affix your no, no, no to it. And that is called a pocket veto. And so that had earlier taken place. Now here, Johnson in 1866 with this very, very monumental civil rights bill, affirming equality under the law to all citizens and citizenship status to anyone born or naturalized in the United States. This is a huge, huge proposed law. Johnson vetoes it. Just remember, Johnson is a racist. He does not believe African Americans should be the equals of whites, so he vetoes it. And then this bill goes back to Congress. That's what happens when a bill is vetoed. And Congress has the option to override the presidential veto. Now, it has to go back through both houses, both chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate. But if they can muster a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate, then they can override the president's veto. And that's what they did. And this is the first time that ever happened in our nation's history, that you had Congress, its dander was so up against the president of the United States, they were able to override the presidential veto. If we could get 2/3 of Congress to agree on anything these days, that would be the miracle of all miracles, right? All right. But Congress was not going to stop there. They could foresee the writing on the wall that the rights and freedoms, protections that they were granting to African Americans with the Civil Rights Act of 1866 were too temporary and tenuous, too fragile, unless they could be cemented in a constitutional amendment. Because it would be very easy for, say, a bunch of Democrats to get elected 10 years from then in the 1870s and then undo everything that they had worked toward and reinstitute black codes and all this other stuff, which, you know, will happen. And so very rightly, they knew they needed an amendment to make this concrete, something that could never be undone. Or, you know, if it was going to be undone, it would be really hard to undo. Now, procedurally, politically, remember, amendments to the Constitution, it takes 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress in order to propose an amendment. So radicals do that. And then it takes 3/4 of the state governments in order to ratify the amendments. What Congress did was that they basically ordered all of, you know, the northern states, they could basically get on their side. For these new southern states, though, one of the provisions they made for them to be able to reconstitute their state governments was that they had to approve not only of the 13th Amendment, which they already had to do under Johnson's proposed, you know, re-governmenting, but they also had to approve of the 14th Amendment in order to become states again and re-enter the country. And so with that provision being locked in, they were able to get this passed. And the 14th Amendment, like, I know I'm saying this about every amendment, like, it's huge, but really the 14th Amendment is a deal breaker. Like, it is enormous. It is the amendment that is most often cited in court in any civil rights case. It's the 14th Amendment. So look at what it says. Citizenship for all persons born in the United States or naturalized in the United States. So if you are born in this country, regardless of where your parents came from, regardless of your skin color, national origin, like any of that stuff, if you are born in this country, anywhere in this country, you are an American citizen. And then it goes on to say that as a citizen, you are entitled to be treated equally under our laws as all other citizens. So again, that's aimed at taking down those black codes. That's aimed at trying to make sure that you cannot be discriminated against based on the color of your skin or other factors, as we will see later on, 100 years later during the Civil Rights Movement, when the courts will actually be, you know, upholding this law. And the big thing here is that it applied these protections not only from the federal government, but also prohibited states from denying citizens these equal protections under the law, what's called due process under the law. So state governments in the South, for instance, were not going to be allowed to infringe upon this because this is a constitutional amendment. And again, specifically aimed at the black codes. The 14th Amendment, it also provided enforcement for this by Congress, just as the 13th Amendment did for emancipation. And there are a few troubling things about the 14th Amendment as well. For instance, it protected the right of men to vote regardless of skin color by basically saying that if a state, say, I don't know, a southern state, were to try to disenfranchise black voters, they would be punished by having less representation. Some of the representation would be taken away because the 14th Amendment, it kind of totally changes. That's what amendments do. They alter or change the Constitution, right? This alters and changes the 3/5 compromise because now African Americans are no longer counted as 3/5 of a person. They are counted as full citizens. This also completely undoes the terrible 1850s Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court that affirmed that African Americans had no rights to which the white man was bound to honor, or that African Americans were literally property. That is also thrown out the window by the 14th Amendment. And so if Southern states wanted to try to disenfranchise blacks, there was a provision in the 14th Amendment that said if men, not women, this is the first time I should say that the gender is actually introduced into the Constitution. Not women are excluded from this. But if men were denied the right to vote, that state could lose some of its representation in Congress. That's how a state would be punished for trying to disenfranchise or take away one's right to vote. One of the other things you should keep in mind happening at this time is in 1866, 1867, this is just a year or two after the Civil War has ended, and all this upheaval, this changes are happening throughout the South. There were terrible, massive riots in many southern cities, famously in Memphis, Tennessee, and in New Orleans, Louisiana, that saw white policemen and citizens and new organizations like the Knights of the White Circle killing dozens of freedmen, these newly freed, emancipated African Americans. And these riots and these massacres, as Blacks were trying to assert their freedom and independence, are going to be another factor that helped to galvanize the radical Republicans in Congress and kind of pushed them to pass the Reconstruction Act, which temporarily divided the South into 5 military districts. Kind of think about, like, I know a lot of you have seen the Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen and everything, we do the bow and arrow. That was 12 districts, but that's kind of like what we're going for here, that the South will be divided up into these districts and they will be administered through martial law. Basically, they will have the Union military, the United States military, overseeing that they are following US laws and putting an end to this kind of violence. So martial law in the South in these military districts. And called for the creation of new state governments that are going to, like I said, have to ratify not only the 13th Amendment, which, but uphold the 13th, but also ratify the new 14th Amendment. And this is going to give African-American men the right to vote. Now, radicals aren't just doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. There is, of course, also politics at play. If you think about it, it does make sense. If radical Republicans want to stay in power, if Republicans in general want to stay in power, they know they're not going to be getting any support once these southern states become reintegrated. They're going to be solidly Democratic. But if the 4+ million newly freed, newly emancipated, well, I should say 2 million because it's only the men, right? African-American men are able to vote. They are going to be voting solidly for the Republican Party, which is helping them out, which is the party of Abraham Lincoln that freed them. And that will dramatically assist Republicans in getting elected and keeping power. So it's also a political play as well. But this Reconstruction Act, it called for the creation of these new state governments, and that is really the beginning of this period of radical Reconstruction, which is going to last until Reconstruction falls by 1877. Now, Congress is going to adopt the Tenure of Office Act, which barred the president from removing certain office holders. Think like secretaries of certain cabinets and department. There are certain departments in the cabinet. Johnson considered this unconstitutional and a kind of a restriction on his authority. Johnson's scratching his head saying, "Why are y'all doing this to me? You've never done this to any previous president." And radical Republicans are saying, "We're doing this because you're the worst," and literally trying to undo the Civil War, sir. Because a lot of Johnson's cabinet were holdovers from Lincoln's administration. They were allies to the radical Republicans. They were themselves Republicans. They were people that Lincoln had appointed in his team of rivals, like Secretary of State Seward and, of course, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And they did this to protect those people from getting fired because these were allies to the radicals in the executive branch. So Johnson's going to ignore this law, saying that Congress didn't really have the authority to pass it anyway. And of course, he could try to veto it, but it wouldn't matter because they would just override it as well. Johnson had tried to veto the renewal of the Freedmen's Bureau earlier. And again, Congress just overrid that and, refinanced the Freedmen's Bureau. So that's why he can't just stop this, but he ignores it. And in February of 1868, he goes ahead and removes the biggest ally to the radicals, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. The House of Representatives responded by immediately approving articles of impeachment. They're like, we passed a law, you violated it, we're going to kick you out. And they presented these charges of impeachment basically to the Senate. So when you do an impeachment trial, it's the process. It goes to the House, where if you get impeached and you're the president, it's like a formal slap on the wrist. It's a formal documentation that you have done something worthy of censure, public censure, something terrible. And that it goes forever in the record books. But that doesn't really mean a whole lot, right? Like, that doesn't actually kick you out. And that's why that trial, if you are impeached, goes over to the Senate, the other part of Congress, who then has the power to remove. And so the Senate, now they had this basically before them. This was the first time that a president was ever placed on trial before the Senate for high crimes and misdemeanors. And by this point, virtually all Republicans considered Johnson a failure as a president. He was trying to undo Reconstruction. He was trying to undo the Civil War, like I said. But some moderates feared that conviction would damage constitutional powers of separation between Congress and the executive. And they have a point. I mean, if you're just playing politics and you have every single Congress that's of the opposite party of the president trying to remove that president, is anything ever really going to get done? We've seen this under Trump, under Clinton, with the other two impeachments that we've had. There is a worry here, and this is why a sitting president has never been removed by the Senate during an impeachment trial, that it'll just be the precedent for all of our future governments, that they will never get anything done if they're always too busy trying to remove each other. And so the Senate voted 35-19 to convict, just one vote shy of the 2/3 majority necessary for removal. So Johnson stayed in power, but he's a lame duck. Again, nothing he does or says is going to matter because he has been completely overridden by Congress. This is the era of congressional reconstruction. And a few days after the vote, speaking of Johnson being a lame duck, Republicans nominate for the 1868 presidential race the former Union general Ulysses S. Grant, the Union's most prominent military hero, as their candidate for president. Grant's Democratic opponent in the election of 1868 was Horatio Seymour, a former governor of New York. And Seymour was awful. And his vice presidential nominee on the Democratic side was even worse. They were basically saying they would undo the 13th and 14th Amendments. They would totally go back and acquiesce to the South, and basically, again, make the Civil War about nothing, make all those deaths having been worthless. And both sides felt this way. It's this idea called waving the bloody shirt, that, what was this all for? What was the blood of my brother? What was the blood of my husband, my father, my son? What was it for if we do this or we do that? And so, I mean, there was Republicans waving the bloody shirt. There were Democrats waving the bloody shirt. Every side was waving the bloody shirt and trying to say what they thought the Civil War should be about. But if you are a radical Republican and you allowed, Seymour and these Democrats to be elected, literally it was going to undo all of the abolitionist gains that you had striven for. Ulysses S. Grant, for his part, he promises to basically uphold the radical vision for Reconstruction and to kind of allow Congress to continue to take the reins, because he's not really a politician, he's a general. And so Grant wins by a very narrow margin. That was a really scary, really important election. Again, just about the amendments, I say everything's important. It is. Like, it was about the soul of the nation, about what the Civil War stood for. It could have gone either way there, but Grant does win. And this is going to be, because of how narrow Grant's victory was there, this is really going to be the impetus behind the 15th Amendment, which finally gets ratified in 1870. But this is the amendment that is going to guarantee the right to vote for African-American men of all colors. It prohibited federal and state governments from denying any citizen the right to vote because of race. But it does open the door to other suffrage restrictions. The biggest being women. Okay, women, gender was first introduced in the 14th Amendment. And here in the 15th Amendment, it does not protect the right of women to vote whatsoever. And you start to see a big schism, a split develop between the uh, the feminist movement, the women's suffrage movement, which had developed pretty maturely by this time, with like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a new ally, Susan B. Anthony. Um, they start to split away from their original abolitionist roots. Remember, a lot of those women that were fighting for the right to vote and for women's rights, they had started off by fighting for other reform movements. Many of them, like Stanton, fighting for African Americans to be freed. Well, now that Black men have the right to vote, a lot of these middle class or upper class white women, they're saying, what about me? Why do I not get to have the right to vote as well? And there will be outrage, there will be racism, there will be a lot of anger there, and that split develops here because of the 14th and 15th Amendments. So yes, there are going to be other ways to restrict voting rights based on the language of the 15th Amendment, and not just against women. The South will find many loopholes, like we explored the loopholes with the 13th Amendment with vagrancy laws and the Black codes last time. Well, in the 15th Amendment, there are going to be loopholes that the South and these southern states will exploit, basically to deny African American men the right to vote. These will be in the form of like literacy tests and poll taxes and other means. Grandfather laws. So basically, like a grandfather law, if your grandfather could vote, well, you can. If your grandfather couldn't vote, well, then you can't. Stuff like that. I'm simplifying it, but that's the basics behind grandfathered in under the law. A literacy test is a test you would literally have to pass in order to prove you could read or write and to qualify for being able to vote. The test was not just a simple display of your reading and writing abilities, though. They were specifically crafted to be impossible to pass. That was a literacy test. And then because they wanted to keep you from being able to vote. And then a poll tax was where you would have to pay in order to vote. And of course, many African Americans, they are newly freed with no possessions, no finances to speak of. That would be impossible. That would be a way to keep them from voting. So there will be many loopholes, many ways to exploit this 15th Amendment that the South will take advantage of. The National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, these are going to be some of those big women's suffrage groups that are going to form during this time. And like I said, they are reacting to the inclusion for the first time of gender in the Constitution that is specifically keeping women from being able to vote. Women felt extremely betrayed. And I say women, I'm meaning these well-to-do white women. They felt extremely betrayed by the 14th and 15th Amendments. It creates this bitter schism or split between radical Republicans and the feminists. Susan B. Anthony will be arrested several times for trying to vote in the 1860s, 70s, 80s. They will continue to fight, and they will use a lot of racist language in their suffrage struggle. These groups, they will be basically advocating racism, saying, how can you allow a Black man to be able to vote before a well-to-do, genteel white woman? And this language was very powerful, and they used it, and it was terrible, but they did feel extremely betrayed by the 14th and 15th Amendments. All right, we are going to stop there, and we're going to get into what congressional reconstruction is actually going to look like in terms of the new advantages that African Americans will have during this brief window when Reconstruction under Congress was taking place. And so we will talk about that next time. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will talk to you later. Bye.